Hi, I'm NoPoly, and I just bought a green screen. Bear with me over the next few episodes while I try and figure this thing out. So maybe you started your first project this week, maybe you've been teaching yourself this stuff for a year. This video is going to cover what I believe to be beginner to intermediate concepts, but no matter your skill level, hopefully there'll be something that you can take away from this video. I've compiled a list of 7 things that I feel like every 3D artist should know, so stick around to the end of the video and find out what they are. Now, take everything that I say with a grain of salt. I'm not a professional, I've never worked in a AAA studio, I'm just an amateur artist who is a game dev enthusiast. But starting off with the more basic topics, let's get into UV unwrapping. So UV unwrapping is one of those things that is a little bit tricky to get your head around at first, but once you understand it, it's really simple. It can be a bit of a boring task, but it is super necessary to learn how to unwrap your game assets. You can think of UVs as your 3D model being unfolded into a 2D image. Now, this might not make a lot of sense at first, but watch what happens when I take this cube and unfold it to lay it flat. By making cuts in the correct places, you can unfold this cube and lay it flat. And this is essentially what UV unwrapping is in a nutshell. You're taking a 3D object, reverse origamiing it, and laying it flat. As you can see, that each face of this cube is being represented by one of these UV islands. By successfully UV unwrapping your 3D models, you can import image textures into Blender and place them onto the faces of your mesh. You will have seams in sections that you cut your 3D model, but that's kind of unavoidable. The best thing you can do is place cuts in sections that aren't going to be very noticeable, but the truth is, don't overthink it. If it's not glaringly visible, then it's not going to be noticed all that much. Another thing that UV unwrapping is critical for is when you're exporting your game assets from your 3D software into your game engine. Let's say you created this sick procedural texture in Blender and you want to take this from here into Godot, Unity, Unreal, whatever. Well, that kind of leads me into my next point, and that is baking. If you're anything like me, when I first started procedural texturing, I spent hours trying to create these textures, bring them over from Blender into Godot, and I'm only met with a white object. If you've done anything procedural, such as color information, roughness, bump, metallic, etc., I don't know, and you're trying to get that over into your game engine, you're going to have to bake those textures. Baking is simply saving that texture information onto a 2D image. Remember that part about UV unwrapping? Well, you need to UV unwrap your assets so Blender knows where to bake that information onto your 2D image, and your game engine needs to know where to reference those textures from to project onto your models. Now, this seems like a bit of a pain, but basically the reason is this. When you create procedural textures inside of a program such as Blender or Substance Painter, that procedurally generated information is being calculated and rendered with tools native to those programs. So if you move an asset that has procedural textures on them into a different program, such as a game engine, that game engine isn't going to have the tools necessary to calculate those procedural textures that you're trying to generate. Thus, you're not going to have any textures on your objects. Instead, we have to bake our textures onto JPEG or PNG images so that when we put them inside of a game engine, it knows where to reference it in accordance to our UV data. When baking textures onto an image, you have to determine what resolution you want that image to be. The higher the resolution, the better the textures are going to look. Be careful though, using 4 and 8K textures everywhere is going to end up doing you more harm than good. It might sound enticing to use high resolution textures leading to better graphics, but that isn't necessarily the case. The higher the resolution, the more demanding it becomes. Like sure, you can stick 8K textures everywhere, but your game is going to take 20 minutes to load and it's going to run at a solid 8 FPS. Developing games is all about optimization. I tend to stick around 1 to 2K textures for most of my assets, but you can use 4K textures for hero items, things that you want to have a lot of detail, etc. Just use them sparingly. But at the end of the day, it just comes down to the kind of game that you're trying to make. In saying that, there is a lot of tricks of the trade that you can use to achieve higher visual fidelity with lower resolution images, such as trim sheets, texture atlases, and so on. But every game requires a different approach, and with enough experience, you'll be able to figure out which approach is right for your game. Number 3, topology and polycount. Now, this is a topic that is often overlooked by beginners, and in my experience, by some seasoned 3D artists as well. But this is a cube. This cube has 8 vertices. It has 6 faces. 6 faces? Yes. And 4. But this is a cube. This cube has 8 vertices, 6 quads, and 12 triangles. I'm really good at maths. When modeling your game assets, you want to work with quad and triangle faces. Basically, you want your faces to consist of 3 to 4 vertices maximum. If a face has more than 4 vertices, that is called an n-gon, and we don't like those around here. The reason being is that when you make your model and bring that over into a game engine, that game engine is going to convert those faces into triangles. Now, I don't know much about computer science or mathematics, obviously, but if your mesh has any n-gons, it's not going to be able to calculate where to put the triangles properly, and you're just going to end up with a very dense topology. This is obviously very bad for optimization reasons. This is bad for optimization reasons, obviously, because your computer has to do more work to make more calculations, and just avoid it. Another reason is when you're trying to animate meshes. If you're trying to animate a section that has a lot of n-gons, it's going to try and calculate that and lead to some very strange artifacts. There's probably a long list of other reasons why n-gons are bad. I can't think of anything right now, but just try and avoid it. Now, sometimes I am feeling a little bit cheeky and I'll let an n-gon slide if I'm working with the end of a pipe or a static object that isn't getting animated. It's not the end of the world, but still shouldn't do it. Topology is basically how vertices, edges, and faces are connected, combined, and arranged to form your mesh. Low poly meshes have a very basic topology, high poly meshes have a very dense topology. Now, I can't stress this enough, but video game development is all about optimization. A clean topology simply makes the world a better place. You don't need 1,000 vertices for something that will take 10 vertices to create. You don't need 1,000,000 vertices to create your low poly assets. The more verts you use, the more demanding it becomes. Just try and optimize it. Now, computers and game engines are much more efficient at handling high poly meshes, especially with things like occlusion culling, yada yada. But without a good topology, things can spiral out of control pretty quickly, and Unreal 6 is not going to save you. Number 4 is high to low poly meshes. Now, branching off of my last point, a very common trick that is used in the industry is creating a high poly detailed asset and converting that into a low poly, less detailed asset. Say you have this beautiful rock and you want to decorate your entire scene with it. Maybe you want to put 20, 30, 50 of them around. But it's a high poly mesh and those vertice numbers add up really quick. Luckily, there's a sneaky little trick that you can do where you create two versions of the same asset, one high poly, one low poly. You put all your detail into the high poly model and then you bake it straight onto the low poly model, and voila. If done correctly, they're pretty much identical. Now, this is a very common trick. Maybe you want to add some screws to your pipes. Maybe you want to add some extra geometry to your assets to give them a little bit more depth. And this is where normal maps are going to be your best friend in this scenario. A normal map is going to tell your engine how light should interact with your textures. Like an optical illusion, it can give the appearance of depth in places where there aren't. Games use normal maps all the time. When you look from afar, things look like they have a lot more geometry than they actually do, but most of the time it's just normal maps. Number 5 is modular assets. Modular assets are the professional lazy method to create large-scale scenes for your video games. Why create thousands of assets to build out your level when you can streamline the process with modular assets? Now, don't be an idiot and try and create one long piping system to tediously try and place into your map. Instead, break them down into tileable chunks that you can click together and fit in any scenario. Now, modular assets do require a little bit of pre-planning, but it's definitely worth the effort. If you take a bit of time to plan out your level layout correctly, it's going to be your best friend. You can create modular walls, pipes, rails, roads, ceilings, anything that you can think of. If it can be tiled, then it can be modularized. Just do it, it's great. Modular assets are also a great way to keep artistic consistency throughout your levels. Leave a link in the description of a blog article based on Skyrim's modular approach to level design. Number 6 is trim sheets and texture atlases. Trim sheets are a great way to create visually stunning levels with only a few textures. Section out a 2x2 plane into as many pieces as you need, fill those different sections out with textures and models, bake it all out onto an image, and start assigning that to different assets around your scene. This also helps create a lot of visual consistency throughout your game, and they're cracked, mate. They're awesome. The beauty of this is you can texture pretty much an entire scene with just a handful of textures. For every texture in your game, it's a bunch of operations that your computer has to do. If you have 1,000 assets with 1,000 different textures, that's a lot of computing power. But if you have 1,000 assets sharing just a handful of trim sheets, voila, that's optimization, baby. The same thing goes for texture atlases. You can subdivide a 2K image into little chunks, and then you can fill those little chunks with images, textures, whatever you want. Then you can assign your model's UVs to the appropriate places of your texture atlas. This is a super common method for indie studios and AAA studios alike, so take advantage of this and use it when necessary. Number 7, last point, texturing methods. Now, texturing is a completely different skill to 3D modeling, but good textures are going to take your game to the next level. They could be the difference between realistic or stylized assets in your video game, and there's a lot to learn. There are many different ways that you can go about texturing your assets. but let's just go over the main ones. You can create textures directly in Blender, be it by texture painting, procedural texturing, or importing images into your materials. Texture painting is great if you want to hand draw directly onto your 3D models. Image textures are great if you want to download PBR textures and place those onto your models for more realistic graphics, as well as just adding images to your models as well. And procedural texturing is great if you want to use logic to create your materials from scratch. Procedural texturing is great if you want to create edgeware for your assets. It's infinitely scaling. You can create realistic textures, cartoony textures, shapes, colors, everything in between. It's great. All of these methods have their pros and cons about them, but one recommendation for me is you should definitely learn how to procedurally texture if you want to get into texturing at all. It's an invaluable skill and it allows you to create your own original materials. Again, this just comes from the kind of style that you're going for. I'm just a little bit biased because I love procedural texturing. Of course, Blender isn't the only program that you can texture your assets in, which leads me to Adobe products. Yes, I know we hate them here. Unless they're trying to sponsor your boy so I can pay my rent. In that case, we love them here. But they are kind of the industry standard, so if you can, you should learn them. First program I'll cover is Adobe Substance Painter. Adobe, I don't know. Adobe Substance Painter is kind of the industry standard texturing software. It allows you to create textures and apply those to your assets professionally with ease and really helps improve your workflow. With that being said, a lot of what you can do in Substance Painter can be done in Blender. Substance Painter is just better at it. The second program is Adobe Substance Designer. This program allows you to create your textures and materials from scratch. This is all done procedurally, and the things you can create with this is, quite frankly, fucking bonkers. If you're an enjoyer of procedurally texturing like I am, then I cannot recommend this program enough. It's Blender's procedural texturing on steroids and so much more. Now, these programs do come at a price. You can pick them up on Steam for about $100, I think, each, or you can also do it through a subscription service. Kind of sucks, but at the industry standard, what do you do? Anyway, this wraps up my video for today. 7 things you need to know to become a 3D game artist. Let me know in the comments if there's anything critical that I missed, and I might make a part 2 and include it in the next video. Anyway, like, subscribe, yada yada. Thanks for watching. Catch you next time.